The United States once had a plan to solve its water crisis forever by literally stealing rivers from Canada and Alaska, flooding valleys, cutting through mountains, and creating artificial lakes the size of cities. A project so big, it would take 30 years, $1 trillion, and the cooperation of 3 entire nations. And here's the crazy part. It almost happened. But what killed it wasn't what you'd expect. Stay with me because what you're about to hear might just be America's most ambitious forgotten dream. In the early 1960s, a group of engineers believed they could solve one of America's greatest challenges forever, with a project so massive it would reshape the continent itself. This wasn't just another pipe dream or experimental plan. It was a bold trillion-dollar promise to end water scarcity in the American West. At its core, this project aimed to take excess water from Canada and Alaska and redistribute it deep into the parched heart of the United States and northern Mexico. It was called the North American Water and Power Alliance, NAWAPA for short, and it wasn't just about moving water. It was about creating a new kind of continental infrastructure. Rivers redirected, mountains tunneled through, and entire valleys turned into lakes. This wasn't science fiction. It was sketched, mapped, and engineered. And the man leading the charge? A wartime contractor turned infrastructure visionary named Ralph M. Parsons. But behind every grand idea lies a greater question. Just because something can be built, should it? As we unravel the story behind NAWAPA, you'll discover not just the power of engineering, but the clash of ambition, environment, and politics that ultimately doomed the dream. In the aftermath of World War II, America entered a golden age of prosperity. Industries flourished, suburbs expanded, and babies were born by the millions. Between 1946 and 1964, nearly 76 million children entered the world, triggering an unprecedented demand for resources. Factories once dedicated to war efforts pivoted to produce consumer goods, vehicles, and homes. And behind all this growth, one invisible resource became crucial: water. By 1950, the U.S. was withdrawing 180 billion gallons of water per day. A decade later, it had climbed to 270 billion. This wasn't just about human consumption, it was about industry, agriculture, and energy. Water was fueling America's rapid transformation, but it was being drawn faster than nature could replenish it, and no region felt this thirst more intensely than the American West. Arid, sun-scorched, and notoriously dry, states like California, Arizona, and Nevada were growing rapidly, even as their reservoirs ran dangerously low. The U.S. was on a trajectory that would require either a miracle or a man-made solution of biblical proportions. Picture the vast, sun-beaten landscapes of the American Southwest. Beautiful? Yes, but brutally dry. Annual rainfall in some regions barely exceeds 10 inches. Worse, soaring temperatures cause what little water does fall to evaporate rapidly, depleting lakes and reservoirs before they can be filled. In the 1960s, this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a looming crisis. Cities like Los Angeles and Las Vegas were ballooning in population, drawing millions of new residents to climates with limited natural water sources. Farmers in California's Imperial Valley were depending on complex irrigation networks fed by the Colorado River, one of the most overused rivers in the world. Even the groundwater reserves, once considered reliable, were being pumped at unsustainable rates. And the problem wasn't confined by borders. Northern Mexico shared the same dry fate. Its northern territories mirrored the climate and the water scarcity of its American neighbors. In short, a water crisis wasn't on the horizon. It was already here. And it was spreading. Water doesn't respect political borders. In northern Mexico, the story was strikingly similar to what was unfolding just north of the border: rising populations, expanding agriculture, and limited freshwater supply. The Mexican desert stretched endlessly, its potential stifled by drought and inefficiency. The land was fertile, but water was the missing key. Both countries were entangled in a common problem: how to sustain growth in regions that nature never intended for such scale. The idea that Mexico could benefit from a joint water infrastructure plan wasn't far-fetched. It was necessary. After all, if water could be redirected with precision and shared equitably, the benefits could be historic. In NAWAPA's boldest vision, Mexico wouldn't just receive water, it would gain energy, prosperity, and agricultural transformation. Almost triple the irrigable land, plus hydroelectric power to light its growing cities. But was such cooperation possible between 3 very different nations? That would become one of the project's biggest tests. Before NAWAPA, America had already proven it could tame rivers. The Hoover Dam, completed in 1936, was an engineering marvel towering between Nevada and Arizona, holding back the mighty Colorado River and creating Lake Mead, the nation's largest reservoir. It generated hydroelectric power and brought water to thirsty cities, symbolizing what was possible when man challenged nature. But even with the success of Hoover Dam and others like Parker and Glen Canyon, it became clear that dams alone wouldn't solve everything. Reservoirs were being drained faster than they could be replenished. Climate unpredictability and rising demand were stressing the very systems once thought unshakable. In other words, America's early water infrastructure had reached its limit. It was time to think bigger, much bigger, and that's exactly what Ralph M. Parsons intended to do. Ralph M. Parsons wasn't your average businessman. By the early 1960s, he had already built a name as one of America's most ambitious engineers, constructing rocket test stands, designing oil refineries overseas, and even engineering missile launch facilities. But his true legacy wouldn't come from war machines. It would come from water. Parsons believed in thinking big, continental big. With deep ties to the US government and a proven record of handling massive infrastructure projects, he was in a rare position to pitch a plan as vast as NAWAPA. His vision wasn't just to solve a problem, it was to reshape how North America used its most essential resource. To many, he was a modern Prometheus. To others, an idealist with a slide rule. But love him or hate him, one thing was certain. Ralph Parsons was determined to do what no one else had dared: reroute the rivers of an entire continent. The concept behind NAWAPA was as bold as it was unprecedented. Take surplus water from Alaska and Canada rivers that currently flowed into the ocean and redirect them southward into the US and Mexico. These weren't small diversions. They were continental-scale engineering marvels involving thousands of miles of canals, tunnels, and dams. The plan would require the cooperation of 3 nations, hundreds of infrastructure projects, and over 3 decades of construction. But if it worked, it could solve water shortages, generate clean energy, and revolutionize agriculture from Alberta to Arizona. NAWAPA was nothing less than an attempt to reinvent nature's design. Critics called it absurd. Dreamers called it visionary. But in Washington and Ottawa, some politicians began to take it seriously. Because if NAWAPA succeeded, it would turn dry deserts into fertile farmland, power entire cities, and connect the continent like never before. Imagine standing at the edge of the Yukon River, not watching it flow toward the Bering Sea, but witnessing its waters diverted south through an artificial network, channeled toward Montana and beyond. That was the core of NAWAPA: reversing rivers, creating new reservoirs, and turning nature's map upside down. Dams would be built at key junctions in British Columbia, holding back rivers like the Liard and the Peace. These would feed water into massive canals, some stretching hundreds of miles. Entire mountain ranges would be tunneled through. Artificial lakes would be created in high-elevation valleys to store and move water using gravity. And at the heart of it all lay the Rocky Mountain Trench, transformed into a colossal water artery, hundreds of miles long. This wasn't just engineering, it was continental surgery, and it had never been attempted on this scale before. If NAWAPA had a centerpiece, it was the Rocky Mountain Trench, a natural geological formation stretching over 1,000 miles through British Columbia. It was the perfect candidate for a mega reservoir, long, deep, and already carved by nature. Engineers planned to flood this trench and convert it into a superhighway for water. Here, gravity would become the system's greatest ally. Water from northern rivers would be stored at high elevation and released to flow downward, minimizing the need for costly pumps. It was an elegant solution. Use the height of the mountains to power the flow and generate electricity along the way. But to flood the trench meant submerging forests, displacing wildlife, and potentially affecting indigenous communities. Even in the 1960s, the environmental cost was apparent. Yet for proponents of NAWAPA, the promise of continental stability outweighed the risks. One of NAWAPA's most brilliant innovations was its use of elevation to solve 2 problems at once: water transportation and energy generation. By storing water at high altitudes, engineers could rely on gravity to drive it downhill, saving on energy and costs. But as the water fell, it would also spin turbines, creating hydroelectric power. This energy wouldn't just power homes, it would power the entire NAWAPA system itself, fueling the massive pumps and lifts required to move water over mountain ranges and through arid plains. In essence, the system would partially power itself. It was a masterstroke of engineering. Use nature's own force, gravity, to sustain an artificial network. Efficient, renewable, and elegant. But again, the complexity of this design made it vulnerable to one thing: cost. And that would soon become NAWAPA's Achilles heel. For NAWAPA to succeed, it needed more than engineering. It required diplomacy on an unprecedented scale. The United States couldn't go it alone. Canada owned the rivers. Mexico needed the benefits. And all three nations had to agree on the costs, the timelines, and the stakes. Canada was intrigued. Redirecting excess water into the Great Lakes would benefit its heartland provinces and restore vital shipping routes. Mexico saw potential too, a chance to triple its irrigable land and gain access to hydropower. But enthusiasm doesn't build canals. Agreements do, and those proved harder to secure than any dam. International cooperation is fragile. One misstep, financial, political, or diplomatic, and the entire project could collapse. Even with support from some lawmakers and prime ministers, the logistics of uniting three sovereign nations under one megaproject eventually proved to be one of NAWAPA's greatest weaknesses. Parsons believed the benefits would speak for themselves. The project promised over 78 million acre-feet of fresh water per year for the U.S., a 60,000 square mile increase in irrigable land, and 3.8 gigawatts of renewable power, enough to light up over 3 million homes. It was a dream of prosperity, scaled to a continent. He projected a $30 billion annual return in national income. Water would be sold, energy would be exported, agriculture would boom. Even areas previously written off as wastelands could become productive again. It wasn't just about utility, it was about rebirth. And for nations recovering from war, fighting drought, and racing toward industrial dominance, that vision was hard to ignore. For a moment in time, it seemed possible, maybe even inevitable. Technically, NAWAPA was possible. The engineering hurdles, while colossal, could be overcome. Tunnels could be dug, dams could be built, pumps could be powered. The maps were drawn, the equations worked, but the project had one enemy it couldn't outmaneuver: the price tag. The estimated cost in the 1960s was $100 billion, roughly $1 trillion today. That's double what it took to build the entire U.S. interstate highway system. With a 30-year construction timeline and hundreds of moving parts, even a minor budget misstep could lead to total collapse. And then came the 1970s, a decade of oil crises, economic uncertainty, and growing public distrust in mega-government projects. Suddenly, spending $1 trillion to move rivers felt less like progress and more like hubris. Even as the blueprint sat ready, momentum slowed. Environmental groups rose in protest, warning of catastrophic damage to ecosystems, wildlife, and indigenous lands. Flooding the Rocky Mountain Trench would destroy untouched forests. Diverting rivers would interrupt fish migration. The backlash was swift and fierce. NAWAPA soon earned a new nickname among critics: the hydrological Antichrist. The very features that made it ambitious, its scale, its reach, its impact, became its undoing. Lawmakers grew hesitant. Budgets were redirected. Environmental legislation gained strength. And so, quietly, NAWAPA was shelved. Not because it failed scientifically, but because the world around it changed. The dream was too big, too soon. Even today, NAWAPA still has its believers. In the 1980s, political activist Lyndon LaRouche revived interest. In 2012, his supporters published a 100-page economic report reimagining the project for the modern world. Some engineers argue that with today's technology and climate urgency, NAWAPA or a version of it could rise again. But would it be wise? The climate crisis, rising populations, and global water stress have made the idea of massive water redistribution relevant again. And yet, the same challenges persist: cost, environmental impact, and geopolitics. Maybe NAWAPA wasn't just a project. Maybe it was a warning that the power to reshape nature comes with a responsibility to think far beyond blueprints. Because once you start to move rivers, you change everything. So now that you know the story behind NAWAPA, the mega project that almost changed North America forever, what do you think? Was it a missed opportunity or a disaster narrowly avoided? Let me know in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious to hear your take. And if you love deep dives like this one, where we uncover the lost chapters of history and engineering, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next forgotten idea that could have changed the world.